Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Jenny, and I'll be facilitating today's event, and I'm joined by Roz. And just before we get started, I just want to do some housekeeping. So we ask that you keep your cameras and your microphones off, and the event will be recorded. So if you miss anything, there will be an opportunity to refer back to the slides and the recording. It will be available on the REC Portal's event page. We will also be using Slido, and I'll be sharing the QR code with you in the next slide. Just ask that you add your full name, and you'll be able to ask any questions throughout the event. Like I mentioned before, there will be opportunities for a Q&A. And so whenever you have a question, just pop it into Slido and we can answer that for you. So this is the Slido QR code. And I think I've also put a link in the chat, and there should be a Slido tab within Teams as well. And I think we'll get started. This is our agenda for today. So introduction to REC Data Spec, a guided tour, how to make changes to the data spec, and a Q&A. So Roz, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thank you. So we do end with a Q&A, but feel free to raise questions at any point during the event, either through Slido or just speaking out, and we'll answer those as they come up, or save them for the Q&A if you'd rather. So we're going to start with a quick introduction to the REC Data Specification, and then we're going to go over to the website where the data specification is held and do a tour of it over there. So if we just move to the next slide. The REC Data Specification, in terms of accessing it, it's on the REC portal. So when you go to the REC portal, if you look at the menu on the left-hand side for EMAR, Digital REC and Data Specification, and click on there, you'll get onto what we call the Digital Navigator, which is the home of the digitized REC and the data specification. And if we move to the next slide. On the Digital Navigator, you have a series of tabs along the top, and the one highlighted in green is the one you're on. So in this example at the top here, we've got data specification, and then you have a menu down the left-hand side, which shows all the elements of the data specification. And essentially, the data specification has 6 sections. So you've got your catalogue of market messages and data items. So that defines what market messages you can send between energy market participants and the data items you can include in those. Then we have the data access matrices. So we have 2 sets of inquiry services, a gas inquiry service and an electricity inquiry service, where you can access data, and the data access matrices define which organisations are allowed to view which data items. Then we have the data specification documents. So these in general support the data specification catalogue, and they contain various rules and information about the catalogue, and I'll show you some examples of that when we go through and visit the data specification web pages. Then we have the meter product data tables. So this is essentially data about gas meters. So it's a list of valid gas meter types that parties can download and use within their systems. And then we have a couple of guidance documents, including legacy information from pre-REC, and then we have pre-release information. So if there's a change to the data specification due, and we've got the legal text ready in a pre-release format, you can access it through there. So if we move to our next slide. When you're looking at the data specification catalogue, some items will download and others will open in your browser, and it depends on which type. So there are, for instance, access format databases, SQL databases that will download, and others like HTML format data specification will just open in your browser. If you do want to open multiple items, we suggest right-clicking and opening in a new tab. Otherwise, you'll just open directly in the page you're on, or you can navigate back and do it that way. And then if we move to the next page. So we're going to focus a lot on the data specification catalogue because that is probably the largest element of the wider data specification. So the catalogue describes data items and market messages that are used by industry parties to send and receive information. And it's not only REC information, so there's not only REC-owned items in that catalogue, but also market messages and data items owned by other industry codes, namely BSC, DCUSA, the Uniform Network Code, and the Smart Energy Code. So the data specification is a single home for the market messages defined across those wider codes. So I'm going to pause there if anyone has any questions. No? Okay, in that case, if we move to the next slide. So can talk about what the data specification catalogue is doing. And essentially, it's creating a framework that allows for the smooth transfer of information from machine to machine, that makes it possible to send the thousands of pieces of information shared daily between energy market participants in a way that can be machine read. So if you could press next for me, Jenny. Let's take an example. We've got somebody working for a supplier with computer A, and then we've got somebody else, let's say DC, working for computer B. If we press next again. So the supplier has spoken to a customer and made an appointment for the data collector to read the customer's meter. In this example we've got here, and they've got a set timescale between 8 AM and 11 AM on the 1st of February. And that meter's really high up, so they need to tell the data collector that they'll need a ladder. So the data specification gives a way for that information to be shared from machine to machine so that person at computer B can pick that information up easily. So if we press next again, what we have within the data specification, you've got defined file formats, and I'll show you in more detail what these file formats mean later in this session. But you've got a very defined file format, and then you've got valid figures that go in there, but we call enumerations. So we've got some example valid meter locations, enumerations, and you can see that R is ladder required. So then computer A can turn that into a data market message. You can see here we've got an extract from that message with R circled that shows you where the ladder required item is, and then that can go smoothly across whichever transfer mechanism is agreed for this flow. And if we press next, computer B gets details of what's in that flow, and then because it's in a database, it can be extracted in any format they want, such as a list of appointments for the 1st of February with notes such as where the meter's located. And that's essentially at its heart what the data specification is doing there. It's just giving a way for information to be shared in a machine readable format. Okay. Then I'm just going to talk about scenario variance because this is something that's new to REC. So if you're familiar with the data specification pre-REC and haven't looked at it under the REC, you might not have come across this before. So pre-REC, what we had were market messages, which is effectively the message that gets sent between machine to machine, such as the one we showed on the previous screen in green. Under the REC, you still have market messages, but each market message is split down into a selection of unique scenario variants. So this is essentially a unique combination of the market message plus the sender and receiver. So we've got some examples here. So these are all the market domain data complete set market message, but there are multiple scenario variants representing the source and target for that message, each with its own variant ID. And it's possible, doesn't happen that often, but it's possible for market messages, or rather for market messages to vary by scenario variant. So the version going from the market domain data agent to the distributor might be different to the one going to the non-half-hourly data aggregator, for example. So there's a slight difference under REC to what came before it. Okay, if we move to the next slide. In terms of the structure of market messages, essentially what you have is every market message is a file that contains a header, some content, and then a footer. And the REC defines the content. So I've got an example under there that defines some content for a message. The header and the footer are defined based on the mechanism that you're using to send the flow. So if you could press next for me, Jenny. So here we have an example DTC header. So they all start with ZHV, and then you've got bits of information in there, including the identification of the market message, the sending roll code. So we can see this is sent by roll code A, which is a half-hourly DA, and the receiving supplier, and some other bits of information in there too. And that tells the data transfer network where this message is coming from and who it's going to. And that's defined because that's outside of REC, so that's defined within the data transfer network documentation. If it were saying going over the IX network, that would be defined in the IX documentation. Then we come to the REC defined element of the flow. So if you could press next for me, Jenny. Here we have the first line of our market message, and we're going to compare this to the data item extraction on the screen below. So you can see it begins with 034. That's our group, and that group is a selection of details, and in this instance it's the contract terms data. And you can see, so you've got your group number, you've got a pipe delimiter, and then you have the first item in the group, which is the MPAN core, and so that's the unique ID for the location effectively. Then you've got a contract reference and an effective from settlement date. So that's what that row there, group 034, is showing. If you look at the extract from the data spec, you can see the column range. In this case, it says 1 to star, which means within this market message, you can have as many group 034s as you like, but there must be at least one appearing in the message. Then if you could press next for me. Our next line is 037. So you can see if we look at the data spec extract, there's actually an 035 and 036 group that are not appearing, and that's permitted because you've got in the range 0 to 0, which effectively means it's optional. You don't have to have this row or either of these rows, in fact, if you don't want to. So in our example, we don't have it. We've gone straight from 034 group to 037. 037 is 1 to 1, which means for every 034 above it, you have to have an 037. And then we've got our final one, 038, the agreed service details. And again, this is a 0 to many. And this one, sorry, if you could press next for me. Now we have it on the screen. So it's got two items in there. Both say 0002. So one's a service reference and the other's a service level reference. And then you've got some data item rules in that final column for these two items. And then we finish with the footer, if you could press next for me. And again, this is defined outside of REC. So this is a DTN footer that's used for the sending of DTN messages. And that's essentially how you build a market message using the data catalogue. Has anyone got any questions? No? Okay. Let's move on. So next, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go for a little bit of a tour through here. Let me just get my screen shared. Great. Are you able to see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen, Rose.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so I'm on the REC portal. If you don't have an account, you won't be able to access the data specification. So if you are new, what you can do is press sign in and it will give you the option to create an account. And then once you have your account, you'll be able to go to the menu here and select EMAR, Digital REC and Data Specification. Click on that. And that will take us over to the Digital Navigator. And we've got our tabs along the top here. So I'm going to select the Data Specification tab. And then we've got a series of options aligning to the 6 groupings with data specification. I'm going to start with all. So if you just want to see everything in a big list, you can do that. And then you can do Control F and, for example, search for API if you're interested in creating an API and wanted the relevant documentation. Then we've got our pre-release information. So we don't have any planned REC data specification changes sitting here ready for pre-release. But once we do, we'll put that information here. We also have a distribution list that we use to notify people when pre-releases are issued. So I've got details on how to join that later in this session if you would like to receive an email each time updates are available. Then we've got the meter product table. So this is a series of zipped files, Excel files. So if I click on this, it will give me a download. If you can see, that's what that's done, is downloaded the zipped files. Then we've got our data specification documents. So these are a series of documents that support the data catalogue primarily. For example, you've got things like rules around how you populate addresses. You've got technical specifications so that you can use these to help you set up an API to receive data through those, and a few other pieces of information there as well. We have a couple of guidance documents. So Annex C is an old pre-REC document that has some information about how to populate flows. So that hasn't been incorporated into the REC legal text, but it's available as a guidance document here. We also have some guidance on how to use our SQL version of the database. So how you can set your systems up to load that SQL database should you wish to, and I'll show you where to find that database in a couple of clicks. We then have our data access matrices. So these are the rules around accessing data on the inquiry service, the gas inquiry service and the electricity inquiry service. Then we have our catalogue. So this is basically a selection of machine readable items and human readable items. So in terms of machine readable, we've got the data specification in access format, and there's a couple of those. There's one that just has flows that go over the data transfer network, and then there is another that has flows, all of REC flows. So data transfer network is so essentially we've got the gas flows as well in the full REC, and the CSS flows, so it's much bigger, this one. We also relatively more recently have introduced an SQL database. So if, for example, you wanted to load data flows automatically into your system so that every time there was a REC release and they changed, you didn't have to go into your system and manually edit them. You could just download one of these machine readable versions and make those changes that way. And this SQL one here links to that guidance document I showed a few minutes ago. We then have the human readable documents. So we've got the HTML format here. So this is basically a web page that has every single market message and data item in a single place. So you can do Control F and find any, for example, if I do that, find the market message. So we've got D300 disputed flows, and then you can see some notes for this message, and you can see the scenario variants. So this is basically the same message, but derived from the source to the target. You can see the message has an owner, the Retail Energy Co. Company. We're going to look at that in a little bit later, the ownership. And then we have a list of all the data items. And then this is the same, the message structure similar to one I showed on the slide. So you've got group 58C, MPAN details, and then it's saying please refer to the address population rules. So you can see there's a lot of addresses here, or address fields, and there's some rules about how you should populate these fields to make sure that different organisations are populating them in consistent ways so they can continue to be machine readable. So that's our HTML version of the data specification. I'm just going to head back, and another document here is the standards definition document. So this is effectively a rule book designed to help in the building of the market messages and ensure they're all done in a consistent way. It's quite big. I'm not going to go through all of it, but just to pull out some interesting items. we've got various data type formats. So at a higher level, there are 3 types of data that can go in a market message. You've got string, which is effectively a string of numbers, letters, characters. You've got Boolean, which is only 2 values permitted, so true or false, or number, which must be a number, plus you could have a minus sign or a decimal point in there too. And then you've got a series of format rules here. For example, calendar date, that's a number, and this is the format that number must take. So you must have 4 digits for the year, 2 for the month and 2 for the day. And that ensures that it's consistent no matter which organisation's sending it, they're all putting the date in the same format. We also have, go a bit further down, a list of the rules around which mechanisms you can send the flows over. Oh, here we go. So here you have a list in this table in 2.11 of the different systems you can send market messages over. So we've got the DTS, the Central Switching Service, the CSS, UK Link with their IX, the Secure Data Exchange Portal. So there's various systems named in here. And you've got the REC rules, but there's sometimes additional rules too. For example, when sending anything over the data transfer service, it must meet the rules of the REC data specification, but also must conform to the physical messaging standards defined by the data transfer service. So for example, if you think of characters that aren't numbers or letters, so exclamation marks, pound signs, percentage signs, there are specific rules about what the DTS can and can't send over. So you have to make sure that you're following those rules as well as the REC rules when populating DTN flows. Just going to pause and see if there's any questions before I go to the next section.
We do have a question at the moment, Rose. It's from Shane, and he asks, do the source and target of market messages data flows directly relate to the MDD role codes for parties?
Sometimes. In fact, I'll show you in this next section. If we go to data specification search, we've got so yes, it should relate to the MDD role codes. We do have, for example, when we filter them, we've got the ability to look at electricity supplier, which would be a role code. That would be role code X. Or you've got losing energy supplier, or role code X in electricity. But yeah, not gas. And then losing energy supplier wouldn't correspond because we've got that little bit lower level of granularity here that allows you to filter messages that are specifically sent by losing energy suppliers where there's a switch. But generally, yes, they have to correspond. In fact, if I go, do you recall the message that I shared on screen, and it had that header row and it had the who was sending it and then who was receiving it? So it had to have a recognized role code in there in order for the transfer mechanism to know where to take that message to. So yes, it should, everything should have a role code that maps to MDD. But in the data spec here, we do have a little bit of lower level granularity as well. So let's tell you a bit more about this search option. So if I go back to here, we've got, in this box here, I could type a data item that I was looking for, say D300, and bring that up. Or if I wanted to see all the list of data items, I can click here and it will give me a complete list of all the market messages. And then you can filter from the source to the target, or you can search. If you're searching, you need to make sure that you click on the relevant item here. So if I try and search for a data item in here, it won't find anything because I'm searching market messages, whereas meter location is a data item. If I click there, it will. So that's how you can view, if you're not quite sure what message you want, but you know who's going to send it and who's going to receive it, you can use this to find that message. Okay, so let's tell you what, let's look at a flow. Oh, sorry, it's not finding it because I filtered the gas supplier there. So here we have a flow, and you can see some notes about this flow referring to that Annex C guidance document that I showed you earlier. You can see a list of the data items in the flow, and then you can pick which scenario variant you want to look at in order to view. And there we have that list of, or rather structure for the market message. And then if you want to, you can click on a data item. So for example, I could click on MPAN core, and that will tell me about this data item. And here we have a list of all the market messages this data item appears in. So it's rather a long list. And we have a bit of information about what this is in terms of how you structure that message. The standards definition document that I showed you earlier will contain information you can use to understand this box here. For example, I showed you the type format rules. So this one is an integer. It has a logical length of 13, and that means that it has, this is basically the max number of characters you can have. And then decimal length is the number of characters after the decimal point. In this case, we don't have any, it's 0 decimal points. And then physical length is the total length. So if we, for example, had minus such and such a number, it would be counting that minus in there as well, whereas this version wouldn't. So there'd be one difference between these two. So that's our MPAN core. So that's the data specification. I was going to go back to our slides now, if I could, Jenny.
Yep, I'll just take controls back.
Great, thank you. And if we could go to the next one. Perfect. So what we're going to do is test how well you've been listening with a little quiz. So first one to shout out the answer or pop it in the chat. We have here an example flow, and in fact it's the D11 flow, and some questions. So number one, what is the title for group 034? And we've got some ABC options there. Number two, what data item is shown in the field labeled number 2? And again, we've got an A and a B. So it's a date, but is it the supplier effective from date or the DA effective from date? How many flows does the data item appear in? And then for number 3, group 038, is that group mandatory or optional? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to have a look into that. Do shout out if you have any questions or you're not quite sure. But essentially head over to the REC portal, go to the data specification, and then search for the D11 flow as your first step. So here we have some screenshots with the answers. So number 3 is 0 too many. So it starts with 0, which means you could choose to have none. So yes, it's optional. So there we go. We've got all the answers there. Great. So if we move to our next slide, I'm just going to talk briefly about if you want to change the data specification. So I mentioned that the REC data specification contains market messages and data items that are owned not just under the REC, but also other energy industry codes. So when you look at a data item or a scenario variant, you'll see the owner for that listed, and I've got one here that's owned by the Balancing and Settlement Code. So if you are looking to change an item, you need to find out who the owner is and then raise your change under that owner's code. And just a word of warning, different scenario variants can have different owners. So don't just necessarily check the first one and assume that it's the same for everyone. And so if we move to the next slide, essentially there's 2 scenarios. A data item or market message change can fall under. So it might have a single code impact. So in that case, you would just go directly to the code manager, code administrator that owns the data item or market message. They would take forward a change under their code defined change process, and then they would send us details of that change once it's been approved, and we would put it in a pre-release, notify our contacts through the REC Data Specification distribution list. The owner code will also be issuing their own communications, and we'll coordinate to make sure those communications are issued in the same time, consistent messaging, that sort of thing. The other potential scenario is that there are multiple code impacts. So if you want to make a change that's going to impact more than one code, or you suspect it might, but you're not sure, you'd need to raise it under all of the impacted codes. And then the cross-code steering group is a group formed of representatives from across the various codes. They will ensure that the change plans and the activities across those link changes are aligned across the different code bodies, and that engagement, wherever possible, is coordinated, so that you get a holistic view of the change, regardless of whether it's going through one code or multiple codes. And if you're not sure the impact or where to raise it, just email our inquiry service and we'll be happy to help you figure that one out. And I've got a couple of examples just at the bottom there. So for example, if there was a new BSC defined process that required a new data flow with new data items, and they're all going to be BSC owned, you just have to raise a change with the BSC, and the BSC code administrator would tell us about that so that we could update the REC data specification towards the end of that change process that they have. Example 2, addition of a new data item to the D0002 market message. So this is one of those messages that has different owners for different scenario variants. Some are owned by the REC and others the BSC. So if you wanted to change this market message, a change would need to be raised under both the REC and the BSC. And then ourselves as the code managers through the cost code steering group would work together to take those forward in alignment. Any questions on changing the data specification? No? Okay. If we move to our next slide. Here we go. So this is questions. Our Q&A section. Does anyone have any further questions about anything you've seen today, or things you haven't seen that you'd like to know? Give a few seconds in case anyone's typing. Okay, if we just move on to our next slide. So if you would like to get email notifications whenever anything happens in relation to the data specification, the main one being when we've got new pre-releases available, you can join our REC Data Specification distribution list. All you need to do is email inquiries@recmanager.co.uk and ask to be added to the data specification distribution list. And oh, I don't know what, sorry, something odd has happened there. I don't know what that was. Okay.
Oh, a little bit of extra there.
Yes.
Thank you everyone for attending today's session. We hope that this was useful for you. And just before you go, we ask that you complete our feedback form on Slido. It just helps us know what we're doing well and what we could do better. Yeah, we hope it was useful. Thank you.